All right, part two with Daniel Crumback to talk about facts because he is the expert in all things metabolic testing and assessment and looking at how we can measure VO2 max and look at longevity. So I dragged Daniel back on the show to dive into these hot topics on social media and YouTube and other podcast platforms. So thank you for making time for us today.
Well, thank you, Debbie. It's always a pleasure.
So I want to dive into our questions I gave you. So it's so easy to go off track, but let's just dive into what are the health and fitness markers that impact our aging process. And then we'll go into what even is longevity. That could be first or after that. So what's longevity? Let's start there because that's the main topic.
Okay. It was funny. I read your question earlier and I thought to myself, it's such a buzzword right now. I tend to always get turned off by buzzwords.
Exactly.
When things get a little trendy. But longevity is being promoted by a lot of companies, whether it's metabolic analyzing companies or blood testing companies or genetic testing companies or continuous glucose monitoring stuff. Everybody is talking about how they can help you achieve longevity. But the fact is, I would say I would define longevity as maximizing your genetics.
Hey, that's a good one.
It's a different way of looking at it. I asked other people, and then I told them what I said. And they went, "Oh, I never really thought of it that way." But to me, it's you kind of start with 100 units of within your genetics itself, and some people are not blessed genetically, so they still start with their maximum ability or longevity is there. And then we spend the rest of our life just tearing that down. We eat poorly, we don't sleep well, we don't exercise properly, we smoke. There's a variety of things that we do that actually tears that number down, those units down, and therefore negatively affects our longevity. So
based on where you've lived so many different countries, so you have a great perspective of why people can say, you said smoking and drinking, and I get this all the time. This is not one of the questions, but just side tangent rabbit hole that I like to go down. Italians, they can go to bed at 11 o'clock at night. People in Europe eat dinner really late, they stay up late, they smoke and they drink. But how come they can be healthier than Americans? Is it because we're moving throughout the day? Have you noticed that? Like, you're in the UK, you've been in Asia, I'm sure you lived in Europe somewhere too, somewhere else. But what do you think of worldwide differences?
It's a really good question. And everybody talks about the Mediterranean diet. No matter how many times it goes away, it always comes back as being, one of the best diets out there. The fact is that a lot of factors interact, right? So if you take somebody who eats well, is happy, and exercise regularly but still smokes, they're not the same as your average smoker that we think of who eats poorly and doesn't exercise. So I was in the military for 29 years, and our regimental sergeant majors would be out there having a fag 2 minutes before a run, and they would outrun every soldier in there, despite the fact they were 30 years older. So it was always interesting to watch that. Now, I think it's terrible for your lungs, that's without a doubt. But the fact is that there's all these factors that interact and interplay, and based upon your genetics, they react more strongly or less strongly. So you've got a specific genetic makeup from Italy that will be part of your question, right? So they come up with a different set of genes than we would in North America. They respond differently to those stimulus themselves. But if they can take 3 or 4 aspects and be able to address them correctly, they'll counteract the negative effects of the others. So, but you look at, there's all kinds of these comments. If you look at China, they all, practically everybody smokes there. The depending on where in China, like in the Beijing area, people eat fairly well, we would think. But if you ever ate there, they have huge salt content that they intake. They don't exercise on a regular basis. They may do Tai Chi or something along that lines, but they will not elevate their heart rate on a regular basis. Yet they're thin, so obesity is not a huge issue. And therefore you'll see a different set of diseases that will be happening there versus what you'll see in different countries. And I mean, looking at that distribution with different countries and different ethnicities is really interesting. And it's really easy to study. You can go online and World Health Organization, and you can look at all these things and be able to determine perhaps what you need to address. But they're always the same things, right? It's not difficult to figure out. It's always what you eat, how much you exercise, how happy you are, how much stress you're under, and how well you're sleeping. Those tend to be the big ones to be able to maximize your longevity.
Mm-hmm. I think that happiness one is key. I know my holistic method, 8 elements, one of them is happiness, but more gratitude and play. And I think laughter, and you read about the blue zone studies, and you look at even how we went through the pandemic, and just even now my job from running a fitness studio and being with clients all day, I have to now, working at home more on Zoom calls and coaching clients from around the world, I have to go swimming at noon to get social interaction. And if I don't go to the gym, have social interaction, I'm like, even today, I'm home and I have something tonight, but I feel sad and depressed when I'm not having that social interaction. So I really notice a difference personally, not being around people that time and having that community. And I think since that shift in my world, personally, with my career, going from fitness studio owner to online coach, you have to make an effort to create that, those relationships and being in a community, even if it's like my master swim or going to the club and having people. But I do notice a difference in how I feel, and you can struggle more, but I think it's important.
It's going to be so interesting for us, 10 years from now, when we look back at those that went through COVID lockdown and what the long-term implications are with that social isolation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of tied into longevity. So a side note, but I just feel like it's really something I think about all the time now. But what we want to dive into more so is, how do we measure longevity? How do we know if we are doing all the right things now to improve how we are showing up to life when I'm older and I can live a long, happy, healthy life, and figure out when to take ownership now? So what do you think?
Yeah, it's important. It's those two components, not just living longer, which is the traditional sense of longevity. It's
Quality of life.
Yeah, living longer with the best quality of life. Yeah, is the most important part. And I think it's the factors that, if you look at those things that we discussed, right? You look at things, for like an example, smoking. And if we can isolate it, we said they did everything else right, but they smoked. So they exercised regularly, they ate well, blah, blah, blah. That's not the general population. They usually have at least 2 of the bad things, and then you have people that have about 5 of the bad things, right? But if you isolate smoking, for example, then their major limitation on the longevity will be respiratory. There'll be secondary implications to the cardiovascular system as well, right?
Yeah.
And even neuromuscularly, which we don't discuss a lot, which is really quite strange, because as being a physio as well, is the fact that you have to have quality of life, you have to reach the end with good musculoskeletal health as well. It's important that we have the ability to test all of these things. Mm-hmm. So Testing the respiratory system is different than testing the cardiovascular system. And then testing the metabolic system, then again, is completely different as well. And then you can check your neuromuscular system as well. And that's part of my master's thesis research is looking at being able to predict injury risk in the future as well. So it's really important that we have a testing barrage, and some that are available to us and some that are more in the medical community. So for example, if you're lucky enough to be able to do blood tests, et cetera, then it's great to be able to look at what's going on in your blood itself, in addition to those other tests that we do. So you'll see something like H1C to be able to look at the long-term effects of their diet and the risk of diabetes. So generally we can't do those tests, but we rely on the results of those tests to be able to analyze for the future and determine essentially the risk of that person developing a metabolic issue like diabetes. Mm-hmm. But we have to be able to test all those things, and we test them not just looking for disease, but also looking at the effects of their lifestyle on those systems, as well as what specific activities or changes we can make in our lives to best affect our scores in those.
Yeah, that's great. I think the effects of your lifestyle on your body, on those systems. So measuring your respiratory system, measuring your neuromuscular status, and metabolic health. And what we do with Pinoy metabolic testing kit that I have, we would do their metabolism at rest and during exercise. And let's talk about that. And then we'll get into respiratory, how to measure that, because I do need to purchase that for our chiropractic clinic where I'm going to test. That is so important to measure that. And then how do we neuromuscular? So let's dive into metabolic health or measurements first. So
I think this is where I couldn't assess people properly without metabolic analysis. So, and I've been doing it for over 25 years. And if you know how to use the data properly, it's extremely informative. So as you know, we'll do a resting metabolic test, which is the gold standard for determining caloric requirements for an individual, as well as for determining what percentage of fat and carbohydrate they burn. So if we look at their ability to burn calories, what's nice about that is we can do a comparative of others, their age, gender, and height, and determine if they're burning on average less or more than somebody of the essentially the same person, the same group. From that, we can determine a lot of things that we need to work on. And as you know, I like to combine RMR with body fat analysis, because that will tell me their lean muscle mass. But I also know that if the person has a low RMR, that they have low lean muscle mass as well. So I think I like combining the two of them. Mainly, I combine the body fat analysis because it's easier to train people. I really use that to be able to show them that we need to concentrate on increasing lean muscle mass, not concentrate on your weight, because those are the people that tend to be overweight. Mm-hmm. So at first, losing weight doesn't mean that you're becoming more healthy. You fit your clothes better, you feel better about yourself. That's very good. And that's part of happiness. But what we really want to do is we want to see them increasing their lean muscle mass. That will speed up their metabolism and therefore will bring up their numbers so they can burn more fat at rest, which is obviously, if you exercise for an hour a day, increasing the amount of fat you're burning at rest for the other 23 will have a significant impact overall. Mm-hmm. And then the other number we collect, as you know, from RMR is the percentage of fat and carbohydrate the person burns at rest. And that's key to metabolic health. So the first one helps us with being able to determine the calories the person requires on a daily basis. That lets us set a caloric requirement for them to either gain, lose, or maintain weight. But the percentage of fat and carbohydrate tells us how well their metabolic system is working.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you've seen where people are burning a higher percentage of carbohydrate than fat at rest. And those are metabolic syndrome people. And this is where you run into problems with people who prescribe the same exercises for obesity at the same intensities. Is they'll say, well, what we want you to do is exercise at this zone or do resistance training. But the problem is you don't really know. Some people respond to it. The ones that will respond to it have low lean muscle mass. So they're going to build their lean muscle mass. But what about those that score really high carbohydrate and their metabolic rate is in the median? Doing resistance training is actually wasting their time in relation to being able to get them to start burning fat versus carbohydrate at rest. And this is essentially that part of, they switch to the diseased, abnormal physiology side of the house. So there's and I think that's the problem, is we do a lot of times, we apply normal physiology to people with abnormal physiology. And I think when you have metabolic syndrome, you cannot make the assumption that physiology is going to respond the same way to exercise. It won't.
So fix the physiology first. Begin with that foundation.
You got to essentially teach the body to burn fat again. And so some people, when it comes to nutrition, it's such a big thing. Those are the guys. Those are the guys that I'll carb starve. Right. And I don't like naming a particular diet because there's no such thing. I just will drop the number of grams of carbohydrates they have. There's no sense naming after anybody or anything. It's just, there's only so many variables you can adjust: the total number of calories and the percentage of fat and carbohydrate and protein that they're intaking. There's no, I don't like the groupie diet stuff.
Me too. I hate saying the name. It's like, just eat real food that balances your blood sugar. So the what you're just answering would be the question people would have is, all right, if I'm supposed to start with physiology first, how am I going to switch from being a carb burner to fat burner? Because so you're saying with nutrition and adjusting your macronutrient ratio, so you become more of a fat burner by dropping the carbs and adjusting fat and protein.
Yeah, and that works really well. But I would suggest I only use those on the ones that come back. I look for, at rest, you should use at least 70% fat and 30% carbohydrate. And you get somebody who has had long-term obesity and metabolic syndrome, because metabolic syndrome needs like a combination of 3 different markers to be positive. What I'll do with those guys, I'll realize it doesn't matter what I do. The minute I get them, if they're burning more carb at rest, the minute I'm going to get them to move, I'm going to just instill this sense of burning carb. And we're in a nasty cycle. So I refer to it as like going down to the basement and flipping the switches and rebooting the system. And in order to do that, we have to teach the body to be able to burn normally. It's not that these people don't have fat available. Most of them are obese. It's just their energy systems are now flipped completely over to carbohydrate. So those guys, I have no trouble, giving them 30 grams of carbs a day, and that's it. How long do I keep them there? Until I retest them and they're flipping back around to burning a majority of fat. Yeah. So I think the RMR is brilliant on that side. I like it for knowing lean muscle mass, how many calories for doing calculations for nutrition setting, and also their percentages of fat and carbohydrate to determine how I'm going to approach their exercise and their nutrition. On the exercise side, like I said, if they're slow metabolism with low lean muscle mass, resistance training goes to the top of my priority. It's not there for everybody, and it's a shame. Like, I mean, we see all these studies that say, resistance training helps people who are obese, and you're going, but it doesn't overwhelmingly help them. And you're going, that's because you applied them to everybody.
Yeah.
And you've got, we should be learning from this. We should be going, well, who are the non-responders and why were they non-responders? It's not that the resistance plan was different, but why did those people not respond? And a majority of the time, it's because the fact they already have good lean muscle mass. It's like when you see studies on exercise, right? And it's a mixed group, and I'm always looking at how much change did it make to those that were already doing those things before, right? And it shouldn't have made as much of a difference. But introducing something new should have made the most difference. And I learned a lot more just by looking at the groupings and the demographic description of who was involved in the study. Be able to go, oh, okay, these are our responders. Otherwise, they look at the exercise program as being the variable, and so it's not. It's each individual, and why some people respond and not. A majority of the time, it's because of the fact they've already incorporated that stress onto their system, and their system has responded to them already.
Yeah. So you're saying there's not one size fits all. And this reinforces why we need to do testing and not guessing to create personalized coaching program to meet the client where they are at by identifying their areas of opportunity or their limiters, what's holding them back to reaching their goals, if it's fat loss or longevity or performance, or hopefully all the above.
Absolutely. So when we talk about RMR, we talk a bit of like that information towards making decisions in nutrition, but also kind of evaluating the metabolic system, right? But you don't know the metabolic system's response to exercise. So without an AMR, an active test, you have no idea how they're going to respond. I've seen people with perfectly normal RMRs, but as soon as you exercise them, they go straight carb right away, even at low intensities. You cannot do only one part of the test, because it's great if you're going to just design a program that's based upon nutrition that has no respect for their activities. Well, you shouldn't be designing things like that. So in order to do that, you must do an AMR, and then you can look at the metabolic response to exercise at different intensities and be able to determine if their metabolic systems are working normally. And they can be, this is my caveat to everybody, your metabolic system can appear like it's not working properly if the other two systems aren't as well. And this is the really important thing about working with somebody, not that just owns the device and does the test, but knows how to analyze the data properly.
Yes, for sure. I've learned that since I've had my kit for the last few months, that I've learned people that get it done other locations, other states, and then they get this report and no one explained it to them right, and the report's off, and it can be tricky. So for longevity, we hear all about VO2 max is the biggest, most important marker to look at for longevity. And we know that you talk about what is longevity, but VO2 max, why do you, well, not why, but do you think it is an important marker of longevity? And is it important to test and not guess what your VO2 max is?
The testing, yes. And do I max test everybody? Yes, except for those that have a cardiovascular restriction secondary to having a cardiovascular incident or having restrictions placed on them by their cardiologist, right? Otherwise, people always ask me, is it safe? And I've been testing, like I said, for 25 years, and I've never killed anybody, because if you take those people that are really out of shape, their max is not that high. It's all relative to them. So I just don't understand the logic. If you're willing to test an athlete to their maximum, and the actual highest level of a person off the street is so much lower, why are you worried about testing them to their maximum? So I test everybody to their max unless there's a medical reason why not. You do have to be careful in the sense you look for certain markers, like you look for SpO2, if their O2 sats are coming down below, about 90, approaching 90%, they're going to get dizzy. So if you're on a treadmill, you have to be aware of those things. But I have no trouble with testing max, but it's not because I'm looking for the max. Like VO2 max, it's nice that we're moving away from some kind of medical marker or a blood test to determine our cardiovascular health. I'm glad it's actually testing our systems and see how they respond. But I don't like calculated VO2 maxes or predicted VO2 maxes, in other words, when there's very little reason to do so. The other thing about predicted is if you stop the person at about 2/3 of the way through the test, you do not know a single thing about how they responded to stress at that level. Is it a respiratory limitation? Is it a metabolic limitation? Is it about O2 delivery or O2 utilization at those? You don't know the breathing frequencies. You don't know the tidal volumes. You don't know anything. You quit the test and said, I don't care about the data at the top. And how can you not care about the data? You need that data to be able to design programs at high intensity.
And there's not as much point to doing the test if you don't get that data.
I truly believe that's one of the biggest problems, and it makes people happy because you can tell them, oh, your VO2 max, your predicted VO2 max, and most of the time they don't say predicted, they'll say your VO2 max is this, and you're going, shouldn't say that. That's not the truth. I think it's so much more important. I care about the data. It's nice to have the number, right, and be able to say, the person started at 32. And they've now improved to 36, and they've gone from poor to good in comparison to others their age, gender, and height. It's motivating to them. But the other bad thing about doing VO2 maxes or predicted is the number of people that take that number and the heart rate and they multiply it by percentages to determine zones or to prescribe exercise programming. And I never ever do that. It's as far off as going 220 minus your age times percentage. So that's what I would say about VO2 maxes. Fact is that if you have somebody who is severely obese, their top level of effort will be top for them, but significantly lower than a lot of other people you push through. And without getting there, you don't know what their limiters are. So therefore, you don't know how to prescribe the right exercise program, nor at the right intensities, nor at the right zone. So
the optimal plan to identify how you can take ownership of your health now, improve your future self, longevity markers, is to test and not guess your RMR, the rest of metabolism, and do your active test to your VO2 max. And then what do you do with that information to go, okay, that's a number. Now what? That's a marker of my VO2 max. Today, I did this test. I pushed myself in a 9 to 12 minute test. Last few minutes are challenging. We got the data. And then how do I optimize my health and improve the aging process with that information? It's just a number.
Yeah. If you don't know, how you performed, how your systems interacted, you've got to tease out metabolic, respiratory, and cardiovascular at all intensities to find out how each of the systems are performing. You may find that you have one or more, usually limiters. One will be the major and then a moderate limiter. Some people will have all three. And what you can do then is you can prescribe your program entirely based on changing the biggest limiter for the individual itself. And with the goal of minimizing or eliminating, that's how I always say, minimize or eliminate that limiter. As soon as you do that, what you don't know it's gone until you retest them, which is really great about metabolic testing, is you can retest them again in 12 weeks. And you should expect the markers that you defined your program based upon should have improved all the way through.
Yeah.
What will also change with that is therefore your prioritization of what you're going to work on over the next 12 weeks. as well as your intensity zones will change. And that's a
big topic.
That's if you don't change the zones and you don't know what intensity they need to work at now to have that effect physiologically on their body, then you're guessing again. And zones can change. I see zone 2s changing 20, 30 beats in 8 to 12 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
So people get their VO2 max measured and then they want to improve it. And we hear all the time from Dr. Peter Attia and other people are talking about zone 2 training and then your interval training zone 5. So we're just kind of guessing there. And that's what I feel like I wanted you to discuss this a little more. All right, let's test our VO2 max and not guess it. And then take that data. We can figure out, all right, how should I train to get my VO2 max higher in 3 months when I test again?
Yeah. And again, I hate to say it, but it depends on the limiter, right?
Yeah. So identify the limiters in your action items.
Right. So if the VO2 max is limited by a particular system, and let's say it's a respiratory limitation, I don't care how much zone 2 and zone 5 you do, until you change the respiratory limitation, the VO2 max is not going to improve, because people forget VO2 max is primarily based upon your breathing.
Yeah.
So
there's a measurement of your oxygen consumption in.
Right, sure. It's an interaction really in between your metabolic system and your respiratory system. But if your respiratory system is the primary limiter, you can still change your metabolic system and say, well, my metabolic system uses oxygen more, but I haven't changed my respiratory system delivering more. So you can frustrate the heck out of people saying that you just need to do this program, and it will work sometimes. If you guessed right, it'll work. It's bound to work on some people sometimes. So what I would say, if I want to improve somebody's VO2 max, first of all, it has to be a primary reason. I see it as being, I'm going to give you a program that's specific to your limiters. Yes, your VO2 max will change because I'm going to improve your 3 systems and how they work. So I don't specifically head out to improve VO2 max. And I think this is where, this whole idea of, the VO2 max is the best indicator of longevity for cardiovascular health is a real problem as well, because people think, well, I just need to change that number. And you're going, okay, you're not seeing, I'm sorry, but it's more complicated than that. So zone 2 and 5 will work well because most people don't do it. I go back to my thing, doing something different than what they normally train, you'll have a profound effect on those people. But if somebody was doing a whole bunch of 2 and 5 before you tested them, doing more 2 and 5 is not going to improve their VO2 max. But most people, as you know, we spend most of our time, first of all, correctly zoning, because I want to be clear with your listeners. Your zones that you think you got, unless you got them through proper analysis, I'm not talking about those zones. Those are just completely made up. But if you're talking about our zones, the zones that the way that I teach how people to do their zones, most of our guys are doing 3 and 4. A little too hard and not hard enough. Right now, 3 and 4 has, zone 3 has cardiovascular benefits and can improve stroke volume as well. Zone 4 can improve lactate shuttle, so it can improve how you work that way as well. So there are benefits for each of the zones, and it's important not to ignore them. But there's an assumption here that a lot of people are doing 3 and 4. Right now, some of them are, and we have to tear them away from that, because as we talked about last time, doing 3 and 4 will actually decrease your metabolic efficiency as well. And getting into 5 will definitely help you with heart rate recovery and will improve your VO2 max. And some of the reason why your VO2 max will improve is because you're good at suffering now, because you never did 5. Now on the next test, you will be able to work harder because you've been working harder.
That top
so
end.
VO2, it's some of it's just doing something different, and some of it is just being able to suffer. Mentally, they know they've worked this hard. Last time that you tested them, they didn't know, and they got frightened about working that hard. They didn't realize they could do it. Now you spend 12 weeks working with them, and they've been working at zone 5, and they go, oh, this is comfortable for me. I know what to expect. Next thing you know, their VO2 max goes up.
Yes.
And you go, well, so I would say, the 2 and 5, and I hear it all out there now. I've never said that to anyone in my life. If you come across my threshold, the thing I'll say is I don't know. I can make assumptions, but I don't have to. I'll test you. If you're not burning fat well at low intensities, then you need to do more 2 to increase the number of mitochondria, the number of capillaries, and zone 5 does the same. So I hand out 2 and 5 mainly for metabolic limitations for oxygen utilization. Now, that fits well with what a VO2 max is. But remember, VO2 max is also related to volume. So if you get them working at higher intensities, the respiratory system will be trained. And when the respiratory system becomes trained, therefore the VO2 max will go in. I always tell people, if you want to fool it with VO2 max, all you have to do is breathe deeply at the end of the test. And it's a great way of getting a really high score.
Yeah. So give examples of what is improving your respiratory system. Just a couple thoughts.
Okay.
People might be confused that respiratory system. I'm supposed to, how do I exercise that besides exercising in general in zone 2? Doesn't that do the work?
Right. So sometimes if they have good volumes, but they don't know how to coordinate their volumes, right? Let's say that they breathe very quickly with a very low percentage of the volume they have available. We refer to that as a coordination issue. You can retrain that relatively easy using a metronome. So you're telling them that in zone 2, you should be breathing about 22 breaths. You're breathing 32 breaths. And you can give them a metronome at 22 beats, and then you can get them to slow down their breathing. Their volume will naturally go up in those phases. So when you send them up for a zone 2, I'd send them a metronome with a range of breathing frequencies, and I'd have them concentrate on that. Because they have the capacity, they just haven't got the capability. So I'll just teach them capability through practice. For those that don't have capacity, and there's quite a few people out there, then you've got to train respiratory capacity. So what I use is a device called Breathe Way Better from a buddy of mine, Luke Way, out of British Columbia. And we've been testing together for 20 some years. But Luke came up with what I deem to be a very reasonably priced device where there's no resistance, because it's one of my pet peeves with respiratory training devices is the addition of resistance. You do not, if you have poor capacity, adding resistance on it will just make it harder to breathe the poor capacity.
What would resistance be? What do you mean by that?
You look at other devices that allow you to dial up the resistance, make it harder to breathe it in. And essentially all they're doing is decreasing the size of the cannula that the air goes through. And they're saying, well, we're going to make you better at breathing, and going, no, you're going to make me better at breathing a really crappy amount of air. And you're going to stiffen my diaphragm, my thorax, all the things that I don't want to do. I want to make the ribs move better, the thoracic spine move better. I want the diaphragm to descend more. I want to create more space. And then I want to build strength, endurance, and power, 3 different things, on that, depending on the individual. So the same as if I take a guy to the weight room, I've got to think, am I after hypertrophy? I'm after endurance. I'm after strength. I'm after power. They're all different workouts, right? So the same thing with respiratory training. So I would say if it's a capacity limitation, use of a device is the best way. If they have good capacity, then I'll just work on their coordination so they can maximize that. You can also use your metabolic analyzer to do live training and just put on your tidal volumes and your breathing frequencies, get them work at different intensities, and get them to monitor the breathing frequency and volume. And it's live on the screen. And you can just tell them that, you're starting to drop your volumes here. I want you to maintain your volumes at this intensity. And their whole focus of their training for that is just, how do I run, cycle, row, and maintain that volume at that intensity. And it's a very, I find that's the best feedback loop out there.
Good information. And then you're saying coordination. If people don't understand that, what do you mean by coordination?
So if we look at their volumes, and I use spirometry, so I look at their lung size, and then I'll look at their tidal volumes during the tests, right? So during the RMR and the AMR. If their numbers are reasonable, but when I look at the test, I see that they're only using 65% of their capacity during the active test, yet their breathing frequencies are really high. They're just not accessing their capacity, and they don't realize they're not. So a lot of the times what you can do is, like I said, if you give them a metronome, you get them to slow down. They have to pick up their depth.
Mm-hmm.
This is where nasal breathing gets a whole bunch of credit where it doesn't deserve, is the fact that it doesn't matter whether you breathe through the two pipes here or the big one in the front. You can breathe slower, right? Just by setting a metronome, and it's a lot easier to get the air through the mouth. And there is all kinds of confusion around about what's going on. There's one thing I love right now is a good friend of mine, Evan Pycon, came out with what's called the NOx, N-N-O-X-X, which is a new, looks at near infrared spectroscopy, but also look at nitrous oxide. And it's the confusion that nitrous oxide that is created within the nasal cavity has anything to do with what happens at the cell or within the lungs. And it absolutely does not. It's a completely different molecular makeup. So unfortunately, there's a bunch of people that think that just breathing through the nose, what you're going to do is you're going to slow down your breathing because you can't get as much air in and out, which is great. But let's not limit the volume in conjunction with that. So a lot of coordination, it can be dealt with just strictly retraining the person and making them aware. And then it only takes 2 or 3 sessions, and they go, oh my God, I feel so much better than I did before. And my performance is going up. So it's not very hard to convince people of that.
Yeah. Well, I think you need to, we obviously test now. I guess you can see that data and know that, oh, I'm not as strong here. And then you can know when, all right, I did this breathing stuff. People probably think it's a waste of time, but then you can see how it's going to impact their health when or their performance when they retest and go, gosh, that really did make a difference. So I think you need to see it to get it done. It's like food sensitivity.
But most of the time with the training, they'll notice a change within 2 to 3 sessions.
Wow.
During their function, not just during the training. And on the retesting, I've increased people 120 liters a minute. Yeah, just I've worked on people with one lung and increased their capacity by 100%. So it's not an if. It will, if people do the work, it will change. But the people that have limitations, this is the terrible thing. Taking that tool and applying it out to somebody with huge lungs that uses them well is not going to benefit. And therefore, you look at people say, well, it didn't work for me. And you're going, you didn't need to do it. But nobody tested you to determine whether this was your primary limiter or not.
Good point.
So you've got to apply it to the right people. That's why I don't like the companies out there selling to every athlete. You're going, can you not just come up with one simple test that they do and say, you know what, save your money. We don't need it. We want our machines to be as successful as possible. No, nobody does that. So the other thing with the respiratory is there's a huge correlation between low back pain and incontinence. I mean, how many women do we know that have incontinence issues all have low tidal volumes or low respiratory capacity?
Oh, wow.
And it's all connected. Everybody will talk about the diaphragm and the connection with the transverse abdominis, and you're going, it's a breathing muscle. So if you train your breathing muscle, you will find that it'll help with incontinence. It also, it has a huge relationship with the muscles that stabilize the spine. So a lot of people with long histories of low back pain will also have very restricted lung capacity.
So chiropractors should be doing these measurements with their patients.
And in fact, it should be one of the number one exercises that we give out if we find a combination of a chronic low back pain and a respiratory limitation. Because the biggest complaint I get from my patients that I give respiratory training to who have low back pain is it recreates all their low back pain.
Wow.
And you just tell them, great, carry on. Let's discuss it in 6 weeks. And they come back and, oh my God, my back has never felt better and I can breathe.
Wow.
So there's a lot of real benefits to respiratory training that are not out there, but my God, there's a lot of devices out there, and they're just being sold off at a massive rate. And you're going, the programming's all wrong too. So
Yeah.
devices add resistance, makes it more difficult to breathe a crappy amount, which doesn't improve capacity. And then on top of that, they give really bad programming.
Yeah, it's out there. So go back to the people in the zones. We're talking about time in zones, frequency, intervals. You know, we collect information on the client, where they are now. If they want to improve performance longevity, what do you suggest? You had some comments about time in zones, frequency, intervals. Anything on that? Because it's a big topic.
So it's a huge topic, but in general, if you find that through your testing, you've determined that they have a particular limitation and they need to do work in this zone to be able to affect that limitation, right? Or that system. And let's say it is zone 5. Then you need to do zone 5 intervals. The biggest issue I have is not so much the time in the zone that people do, because generally we pull all that from the science, right? Everybody uses about 10 to 30 seconds in zone 5. But it's the work to rest ratios that kill me.
Yeah.
Right. So you take it's the same work to rest ratios, no matter who it is. You're telling me that if I take somebody who has never trained before and is overweight and deconditioned and put them on the track and get her to do a zone 5 for her, which will be significantly slower versus a higher level athlete, but I give them exactly the same time to recover, that makes any sense at all. Absolutely not. And the chances are that the person that is out of shape is not going to be able to hit zone 5 for the length of time required to put the physiological stress on. So my intervals are all based upon time in zone. So it's horrible, and I appreciate it. As I said to you at the start of this, I got mentioned on another podcast, and it was just, that's how Daniel taught me how to do things, and they're horrible. So your time doesn't start until you get in zone 4, because you need that stress, that period of time of stress in that zone. It can't just be ramping up and ramping down and thinking that you're doing anything, right?
Good point.
So if you're going to do 10 to 30 seconds, it counts when they get into zone 5. And then the recovery is the same ratios, but the person who's more conditioned will get into the recovery zone much quicker than those that are deconditioned. And it's relative time of rest in recovery zone.
Mm-hmm.
And just this move from 5 to 1 and 5 to 1 and 5 to 1, for 10 repetitions, for example, will teach the body to be able to achieve huge amounts of energy production and then recover quickly, because the body learns that, oh, you're going to do this to me all the time. I better get good at this and better get all the systems associated with being able to respond to this stress more quickly responsive. And so I think, zone 4, I use usually about 90 to 180 seconds. But if you're doing zones, for example, you have cyclists that work for you, if their biggest limiter is leg strength, then you can use wattage. Right? Now, wattage is wattage. They don't have to get up to a heart rate to cause the physiological change. So I use the same length of time and I use the same system of recovery based on heart rate, but the time in the zone is based upon the wattage because I want to increase their leg strength. I want to increase their coordination. I need them to experience what it takes to turn 400 watts for 30 seconds and still keep their pedal stroke, a correct pedal stroke. So I think there's a lot of people that hand out interval programs, and they're all time-based and not heart rate based is a real problem.
Yeah.
And it should be time-based, but in their zone. So you have to wait for their heart rate to reach and the heart rate to drop.
So when you're using a heart rate monitor to do a 10 to 30 second sprint, you're not going to get that real time because it takes longer to catch up to it when you're wearing a chest strap. And so it almost kind of does that for you, that once you get there, you almost have to wait till your heart rate monitor to catch up. So then, okay, I probably, once that shows up on my monitor, maybe it has been 10 to 30 seconds once I finally see that number, and then to come back down when it hits.
Well, I worked with Moxie to design a Garmin app.
Yeah, that's right.
Because let's face it, if you're doing 10 to 30 seconds all out, you don't have time to be monitoring your watch. So I just built a system that combined the zone requirements in the Garmin with the time requirements. So you hit start, and you just bury your head. And as soon as it gets there, you're gonna get a buzz and a beep, and then a buzz and a beep after you've held it for the length of time required in the zone.
That'd be good.
Then you bring yourself cool down. When you've reached your top of the recovery zone, it'll tell you again. If you drop out the bottom, it'll tell you, but it'll tell you when you've had your ratios. So you enter in your work to rest ratios, and it'll actually keep you in that spot.
Wow, that's a good idea.
And it's so simple because I do know it's awfully hard to be pushing that much wattage or working at that heart rate and paying any attention to that. So what you want to do is you want to know that it's there, and all you have to do is punch the workout in, and it will warn you ahead of time each time. And what'll happen is by the 10th rep, it'll take you much less time to get into zone 5, but a longer time to recover, which means that, hey, logically, your actual work to rest ratios are actually extending just naturally, the way it would be. And right now, I think a lot of people who do intervals knowing what they have to do and making sure they could do 10.
Yeah.
So they'll
then
cheat.
They're doing, yes, exactly.
Yeah. They'll cheat to make sure they get the workout out.
Yeah. But I was going to throw in too that there's people doing that every day, like Dr. Rhonda Patrick, not to throw under the bus, but you need to get her on her podcast, and I'll try to get you on Dr. Peter Attia's podcast. But that's what she talks about all the time. Oh, I'm doing Peloton bike, Tabata intervals, 10 minutes every day. And I was like, okay, that's not what he's talking about. HIIT training. And so the science-based side of it would be what you're saying, zone 5. But so how many times a week? It depends on the person, but what is the optimal kind of recommendation? General.
I'm sorry to keep saying it. It depends on how much time we have, what other priorities we have built into their workouts. So if it's a primary workout, let's say their biggest limitation is metabolic, and I want to promote, ATP synthesis and mitochondrial density and capillarization, then I'll build usually 3 to 4 twos, depending on zone 2s, depending on their dates, their number of days they have, and at least 2 zone 5s.
Yeah, I always look at minimal effective dose is what we're talking about. Like, what is the amount?
Yeah, I would say I try and get 2 in for sure. And with the goal of getting rid of all, my ultimate goal is to have no major or moderate physiological limitations to performance. I want to take the person and just train them specifically to their event, right? So the beginning of each year should be your goal as an athlete and a coach. It should be to eliminate physiological limitations to performance, and then try and keep them at bay the whole time, while working at event-specific skills training for that.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought about when you and I talked was we've never talked about MSK, and I thought to myself, isn't that funny? Now I'm back treating people every day. So many of them are limited by musculoskeletal health.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then everything else suffers. You try and maintain their fitness as well.
Yeah.
But there are ways of testing to determine your degree of risk of injury in the future. So I would suggest that that's another side you should look at. I've never seen so many hips in my life that are heading towards total hip replacements.
Wow.
And you're going, they all could have been saved. Every one of them could have been saved.
Yeah.
If at the age of 50, we gave out one program for them to do. Everybody do this, and we would basically eliminate total hip replacements. And I'm not joking. I bet you we could cut it down 60, 75%. It's just that people aren't moving their hips in the right ranges of motion, keeping their mobility and the flexibility and their strength. And it'd be so easy to design programs to stop people from running into these problems later on when it's too late.
Yeah. No, I know. And there's so much to dive into there, because I know my left side hip, I just doing mobility drills is trying to get this left glute stronger, and it just impacts my running. So I can't get my running performance up because my limiter is my strength, and I cannot get it to fire. And I've been working on it for a few years, but I can do my HIIT training on a bike and gradual hill and get it. But when I'm on my feet, my mechanics are horrible because of this left glute medius, but it's an important part.
Yeah, I think it needs to be added to the discussion on longevity.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, that's a whole third part. Muscle strength, because that's what, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon is all about in her new book. It's coming out on muscles, and muscle is your organ of longevity, and how you got to just focus on getting stronger. And that's an important part of longevity is muscle strength. And that's huge, I think. But I know we're already out of time, but the importance of athletes, aging athletes, to get their right type of training, but they forget the interval training and they forget the strength training. And I think even more so the strength training, a lot of triathletes and endurance athletes just tend to do, oh, I'm getting hills on my run, or I'm outside. I don't need to do strength training. So they get that mentality. And then also I'll finish with, I think so many people, we are thinking we need more zone 2 training. And then looking at what I'm learning from Dr. Stacy Sims for specifically the aging female athlete is a whole nother topic that I want to try to start paying attention when I do metabolic testing on females that are post menopause, on the differences in personalized program. Because Dr. Stacy Sims says less chronic cardio and more weights and more HIIT training. So another
you know what's interesting? After 30 years of doing this, and I don't want to get myself in trouble with anybody, is that you will find a higher majority of women quite happy to do lower intensity work for longer durations than you'll find men willing to do that. And I think, just running into that higher percentage, they're going to have better metabolic systems in zone 2, and therefore they should do less. And again, it's just whatever you're doing for the last 12 weeks, for God's sakes, do something different, and you're going to probably get something beneficial out of it. But that's one thing I would say over the years is trying to get some of my female, not necessarily even athletes, general population, to suffer harder, to push them into a zone 5. I tell a lot of my guys that I work with is you're not going to get a 5 out of her. Create a 4, get her comfortable in a 4, and then move her to 5. And it'll take her 12 weeks to feel comfortable at 4, because people get panicked up there. Yeah. And you have to know the personalities of each individual. So you're going to go, no, you're never going to get the time that we need for the dosage, but I can do that. Treat her for like a 5. Then we'll create a 5, and we'll go get that later in 12 to 16 weeks. Yeah. And it works. It works.
Yeah. And that was, I'll just finish with this, that a lot of people I was saying are afraid to do a VO2 max and push themselves that hard, as you said, but also afraid to do that hard, high intensity training. I just was at the gym this morning and going to this new place, and I look at everyone on the cardio machines over there going, okay, this is, every gym is the same way, but just waste of time type of workout. Almost. That's like, what are you doing? But they don't want to go hard. And then Stacy Sims has a good saying of, you know, it's that gray zone 3-4, that it's too hard to be easy and too hard to be, or too easy to be hard. And that you have to figure out what that is for you and figure out where to start.
And the negative effects it has on capillarization and mitochondrial density. People, I keep going back to, you know, the science shows that it negatively affects your system with prolonged work in 3 and 4.
And most people I watched doing, I said this in my show the other day, that most people are running with groups of people and cycling teams. They are, I swear, zone 3 the whole workout. So they're really not helping their mitochondria that way. You're saying?
Nope. And this, I let my guys that train in groups, they get 1 workout a week, but I want them to analyze their own workout. What was it? And it's always zone 3, zone 4. It's like, great. You don't get any more 3 and 4 from me, right? But you're not allowed to ride with other people unless you find somebody who can push the same wattage as you at that heart rate zone.
Yeah.
Because you got to match them to their power output. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to ride with them and achieve their goal.
Yeah.
So that's why cyclists like working with me, is because you don't tell them no. You just say, well, you can't go out and water unless your wattage output's the same, and it keeps you in that zone. So go find somebody else that pushes the same wattage. And they go, well, you know, they're only pushing 180 watts. And you're going, yeah, you have a problem with thinking that you're better than what you are right now, or stronger than what you are. So you can work with people, that's for sure. And there's nothing wrong with training for speed. There's nothing wrong with training using wattage, but there's nothing wrong with incorporating it with the individual's physiological response. So that's why I always like to incorporate the heart rate.
Awesome. All right. So where can people find you if they want coaching or assessments or mentoring? Learn more?
You can contact me at strategichealthandperformance.com. I'm in the North and Cumbria region of the UK, but I do work internationally online with coaches as well as individuals. And otherwise, you can email me at strategichap for health and performance at iCloud.com.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for your information. We'll get that out, and everyone please share so we can help educate others how to properly train to improve their performance and longevity.
Wonderful. Thank you.